I'm pleased to be joined today by Dr. Webb Keane. He is the George Herbert Mead Distinguished University Professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Michigan and the author of Animals, Robots, Gods: Adventures in the Moral Imagination. Webb, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Well, thank you, Adam. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, let's start with the title. You don't often see these classes put together: animals, robots, gods. What's the through line between all of those?
And I should say there's a big chunk about AI too, but I only wanted 3 words in the title.
Yeah.
And there's also people on medical devices, which is another chapter. So the power, the rhetorical power of the 3-word title overrode an accurate description of the contents of the book. The idea here was to look across things that seem to be unconnected and in separate domains, that if you step back and look at them from the right angle, you start to see patterns and connections among them. So a major thrust of the book is a major sort of starting point or inspiration for the book was to say, look, there's a lot of new stuff happening in the world that seems completely and totally unprecedented in human experience, in human history, and can either be really frightening as a result, or it can be, promise sort of, utopia is at hand. We finally reached the culmination of everything we've been hoping for. Of course of humanity, these kinds of uh, hyperbolic, highly excited responses to things like robots, artificial intelligence, ChatGPT, and so forth. And as an anthropologist, part of my job is to sort of look at things in a very large perspective, to step back and say, well, let's take a look at this, uh, taking in sort of all of these things we know about humans, that extend beyond the immediate here and now of, a North American university campus, which is where so much of the discussion takes place, or Silicon Valley, or Wall Street. And there's a big world out there. And part of our job is to know more about that big world. And when you do that, you find that there are many things about robots and artificial intelligence and the ways people are responding to them that are tapping into much more widespread, much older, much deeper patterns of human encounters with things that are like humans or near humans, resemble humans in some way. They come close to us, but are not quite us, and produce interesting and uncanny effects. And that in certain ways, what we're encountering when we encounter robots and when we encounter AI is not as unprecedented as we think it is. And if we take that step back and look at these larger patterns, we may gain some insight into what is truly new. Because certainly, there's what's going on with AI right now is truly unprecedented in many important ways. But in many ways, it's also, we're responding to it in ways that reflect much deeper and older patterns. So I started looking around at the things that we know about the way humans have interacted and do interact with what I call uh, near humans, quasi humans, and superhumans. Um, and I looked for sort of useful examples from this spectrum of anthropological studies, mostly anthropological studies, uh, of human interactions with these people just across the border from the human, just over there and on the other side, non-humans. And among these are animals, particularly domesticated animals, but also animals that are hunted or made objects of sacrifice. And I also looked at people who are in medical conditions, usually near-death conditions, that render them not fully capable of being the kind of human that we usually think of as a moral subject, people who are comatose or in vegetative states, who are only being kept alive because they're hooked up to machines. And therefore, in some sense, are like cyborgs. There's this there are uncanny combinations of machine and person. And I started to look at it. So what do we do with these? And of course, then there's gods. And one of my early inspirations for this was reading uh, that Elon Musk um, had very early on started to talk about AI as being godlike. And I've
Mhm.
started to notice that a lot of people who are otherwise think of themselves as being totally secular, totally highly scientific, super rational. Uh, when it comes to AI, they start using this religious language. Um, uh, and Musk is not the only one. There are many other examples like that. Um, and so I started to think, well, what's going on there? One of the examples I use in starting the book is from a report in the New York Times about a year or so ago, where this man who used to work was a product developer in Silicon Valley, the computer industry, and he had then retired to or he left that and become a pastor, but he's still living in Silicon Valley. He's still very much part of that world. And one night, he says to, I forgot now, I think it's Alexa, but whatever the devices he has in his house, he says, turn on the lights. And all the lights in the house turn on. And suddenly he catches himself. He said, oh, God, I just done something that God does in the book of Genesis. I've said, let there be light. And there was light. And I was really struck by why is it that what's going on when people make these religious connections to things that we can explain in purely technological terms? And this is a guy who's comes out of the tech world. He knows technology, he understands it. He's not, he's nobody's fool, right? He's not tricked into thinking this is a magical effect, and yet it worries him. And what worries him, this is the second inspiration for the book. What worries him is that uh, he's troubled by the moral consequences of being able to do this. I can now do something that in the Bible only God could do. Is that going to affect my soul? What are the consequences for me, the kind of person that I am, that I imagine myself to be, if other Silicon Valley people are talking about AI as God? Sometimes they're talking about it fearfully. Sometimes they're talking about it in what to me are much more frightening terms, that they themselves might become godlike. So anyway, these are some of this is some of the thinking that pulls together animals, robots, and gods.
There's so many strings this is pulling on for me, Webb. Thank you for sharing. That last piece about let there be light reminded me of this comedian skit about how people complain about flying. They're tired, it's crowded, they don't have enough leg space. And he's like, you're sitting in a chair in the sky. You're like Apollo. You're like a Greek myth, and you're complaining about it right now.
That's wonderful. I think this is the thing. Yeah, we take for granted all of the sort of godlike things that technology, accomplishes. And what I'm interested in particular, and I think I think that's really spot on in many ways. But what's so the comedian is interested about in the kind of mundane, what we've taken the remarkable and made it mundane.
Hmm.
There's another side of it, which is taking the mundane and turning it into the remarkable as well. Because part of what's going on with, let's say, the Turing test is that we've designed these devices that are getting very good at doing something very, very mundane, something very ordinary, which is prompting, triggering our fundamental capacity to enter into social interaction with things and impute intentions to whatever it is we're interacting with. You might say, there's a brilliant anthropologist at Berkeley, Terence Deacon, who prompted me with this thought that the Turing test is not really a test of the computer; it's a test of us. And what it's testing is our lifelong, from the minute we're born, we have a lifelong, we spend virtually every waking minute of our lives, most of us, interacting with other people. And so by the time we encounter a device like that's designed to interact with us, we know how to interact with it because the first thing that we're going to do is start to look for intentions, start to interpret the signs it's giving us. In the case of AI, it's typically words, and making sense of them and imputing intentions to it because that's what we do. This is how we encounter the world more generally. It's, usually it's other people. Sometimes it's our pets or, the cows on the farm, or the horse, but it may also be the computer that you cuss out when it crashes at the crucial just before your deadline, or the car that you kick when it breaks down. These are seemingly trivial examples, but in some sense, uh, our interactions with AI are often really variations on the same theme. Now, the God part comes in. Uh, Before I mentioned this idea that uh, an AI might become like a God. And then I mentioned the pastor who says, well, maybe the AI is making me like a God, which is what the comedians joke about airplanes is saying that we've become godlike thanks to technology. But another way you could look at it is to say, we're doing what we've always done when we encounter gods. So I was very interested in the development recently of something called Ask Delphi. I think it's Delphi.com, which is it's an experimental program, experimental artificial intelligence that is an experimental AI program that answers moral questions. You come to it with moral problems. Now, where does it get those questions from? Now, notice that it's the first thing I'll say. It's named Delphi. It's named after the ancient Greek oracle that was very important in for several centuries in ancient Greece. It was there was a person who basically would go into trance, and you would come and ask the oracle question. You would pose the oracle questions about your usually moral problems, sometimes questions of war strategy and so forth. The oracle in a trance would speak, but the idea was the oracle is actually saying the messages are coming from the god Apollo. And um, the oracle would typically speak in enigmatic ways that were not obvious. It was hard to know exactly. It wasn't like ordinary speech, hard to know exactly what to make of it. But people irresistibly made sense of what the oracle's saying, because that's what we do when we interact with conversation partners. Is we're very good at making sense of them, and we put a lot of work into making sense of them. And you do that even with sort of inscrutable comments by oracle. Now, this AI was doing the same thing. Now it's not being inscrutable because it's designed to come out with very clear sentences. But what interested me is that when the people who designed this are tapping into this fundamental idea that if you have a disembodied entity that seems to have knowledge, greater knowledge than anyone else could possibly have, it would be a source of wisdom. It would be like a god or an oracle that speaks on behalf of the god. And in some sense, without, I think, even thinking very hard about what they were doing in that respect. They were reproducing the way spirit possession, spirit mediums, and oracles and prophets work by tapping into certain fundamental properties of AI, that it is unlocatable, it's disembodied, and it seems to know more than anyone could possibly know. Now, I'll add to this, how was this AI programmed? They used a very it wasn't exactly programmed on LLMs, but rather, or those large language models. But what they did was they did what I consider to be sort of the modern equivalent of talking to God. They crowdsourced answers,
Mhm.
and they basically they got us something like, about 1.5 million to 2 million people to provide answers to moral questions, and they fed it into this device. And essentially saying, this is the wisdom of the crowd has come to take on this sort of divine quality. And
Mhm.
the result is uh, uh, they essentially reproduced a very old human technique for seeking answers to hard questions. It's one we see all over the world, and it's thriving in the present day, which is spirit mediums, oracles, divining. Ancient China had the I Ching, Greece had the Delphic oracles, the Romans had sought auspices in bird flight and so forth. But spirit mediums are very active around the world. I mean, yeah, yeah. When I was living in New York, they were thriving down the street from me in the Lower East Side. So um, they were, in a sense, reproducing a very old technique, and they were doing so by tapping into the affordances of AI. It's disembodied, it's enigmatic. You don't really know where those answers are coming from. And because you don't know where those answers are coming from, well, maybe it's something transcendentally wise, like a god.
I used to imagine if ancient philosophers were walking around today, and this was before interactive AI like ChatGPT, I was just thinking about Wikipedia as this endless source of knowledge that at my fingertips, I can essentially access any answer that humanity already has to any problem. And really, except for when I have a question or an assignment that I need to check some information for, I'm not using it very often. And I was imagining someone who grew up without it, it's like the amazing becomes mundane, like you mentioned. I wasn't really utilizing it, but I was imagining if Socrates is reincarnated here, wouldn't he just be fixated and glued to the screen and soaking up all the world's knowledge? So then I thought about that again when ChatGPT came along because it's the same thing. Now it's even easier because it's interactive. I don't have to go searching on an online encyclopedia. I can just ask this godlike entity any question that comes to mind. And I've played around with it like that occasionally, but really most days I'm not doing that. And it surprises me.
Oh, that's interesting. So perhaps, I mean, one option, one possibility is that this really scary thing is going to become just another piece of a toolkit like Wikipedia that you use once in a while. I would love to believe that. I'm still a little frightened, I gotta say.
Mhm.
But uh, I I think part of my point here is simply to try to contextualize AI within the larger range of things that humans do and have done. Recognize uh, how rooted our interactions with it are in these pr practices and intuitions that we already know from other contexts, in order to sort of
Mhm.
weed out the difference between what is truly different about it and therefore possibly dangerous, and what is actually fairly mundane. Um, and part of the mundane part of it is just that uh, we are really good at interpreting things that seem to give off signs, language like signs or other communicative signs, interpreting them and imputing human like characters to this. Uh, and the other side of the book, so that's part of what the book's about, and the other dimension of that. And in the process, we often endow them with moral or ethical characteristics. So part of the book is about how humans interact with animals. And the first thing what I start off with is traditional hunters, traditional societies who must live by hunting because they typically live in the ones that I draw on typically live in places like Siberia where you're not farming in Siberia, so you're going to live off of animals. And what's really interesting is across the range of traditional hunting societies, you find that people treat the animals they hunt as moral subjects. They address them in the second person. They talk to them. They say you. And when you address someone as you, a couple of things are happening. One of which is you're treating it as if it was at least potentially human-like, as if it had at least some of the core features of a human being. Uh, the second thing is that when you address someone as you are implicitly saying it could in every word how the way think about the way we use I and you in conversation. We take turns being I and you as we carry on a conversation. When you're Adam, I'm addressing you right now, but the minute you start speaking, I'm going to be the person who's you, and you're going to be the I,
Hmm.
right? So um, the implication is if I can address a bear or an elk as you, uh, it invites me to imagine that it could address me as you, and therefore it opens up a way for me to see myself through the bear's eyes. It's a way of getting outside myself and imagining who I am as seen from the outside. There are many societies that have really run with this idea and elaborated it. So in in many Amazonian societies, turns out uh, that they've elaborated this idea that a French anthropologist has called, or a Brazilian anthropologist has dubbed perspectivism, and that is uh, that they've come to understand the animal world as being the mirror image of the human world, where jaguars think that they're people and they think that we are jaguars. So what they're doing here is they're essentially taking that basic dynamic. What happens when I address somebody as you? When I address somebody as you, I am putting myself in the position of being a person they could address in turn. We keep switching roles when we say I and you. And if I do that, then in some sense it then invites me to imagine who I am to you. What do I look like to you? And that's what they're
Hmm.
basically saying. Well, from the jaguar's point of view, I'm the jaguar and I'm the prey. Now, the next step that follows from that, and we see this with traditional hunters, is well, an entity like that is also someone who's likely to have some kind of moral qualities. And when I talk to you, I have to treat you as an ethical being. I have to treat you right. I have to interact with you as if the crucial point here is our relationship is not ethically neutral. Yes, I'm going to kill you because I'm a hunter and I have to live off of the meat that you will provide me with. But when I do that, I am forced to acknowledge that what I'm doing is not ethically neutral. It's not simply a matter of transferring protein, from your body to my body, or some kind of totally banal kind of thing like that. I have to recognize that there's a moral price that I pay for having to live off of you. And we find this over and over again with hunters. They don't sentimentalize these animals. I mean, they're not remotely, these are hard-headed, tough living people who are very savvy about how do you hunt. But they also recognize, as one anthropologist said about the Inuit, they cannot avoid being aware of the fact and sometimes concerned about it, worried about the fact that they live off of the souls. They live off of souls. They live off the souls of other creatures. Doesn't stop them from killing them, but it forces them to take moral responsibility for what they're doing.
Hmm. And my fiance and I got a puppy about 6 months ago. And one of the things we noticed early on, she would get separation anxiety. So if one of us left, puppy would go at the door and just sit there and wait. And if it was something like taking out the trash and we're back in a minute and the puppy could hear the footsteps, then just the tail would start wagging as soon as the footsteps were coming back. But if she could hear them really leave the hall and just close the door, not come back, then she started to whine. And she'd whine for several minutes until she just came to accept it and then got so excited when we come back. And then also, you could see that she had some sort of moral emotions like guilt. If she peed indoors or chewed something up and we got upset, the ears go down, the tail goes tucked between the legs. So it didn't seem like she's just reacting to punishment. It seems like even if we just said her name and pointed at the thing that was chewed up, she knew instantly, and there goes the tail. And I've been trying to think about this from mammalian evolution perspective. Uh, Primatologist Franz de Waal had this great study where he was looking at jealousy in monkeys, and the way to test that, it was a simple game. They could trade a token for some food. They could do it for cucumbers or grapes, and they're perfectly happy doing it for cucumbers, and they're more excited to do it for grapes. But if you give one cucumbers and the other grapes, then the one that gets cucumbers, instead of continuing to accept it, it takes a look over at its
It's
playmate.
not fair.
Right. It throws the cucumber at the experimenter
Right.
and starts
Right.
shaking at the cage.
Yeah.
So they must have some internal sense
Yeah.
of fairness. And thinking about this from an evolutionary perspective, well, it makes sense that if humans have it, if monkeys have it, for both primates, maybe the basic components of that moral emotion evolved in the brain millions of years ago. And I think with dogs who are even smaller brained and more evolutionarily distant, but I see something like this in the guilt of my puppy.
Right. I mean, there's some controversy about Franz de Waal's experiment, but I think the basic point is an important one, and that is, animals are, we it's animals that we interact with become moral if either whether they've evolved to be moral beings or whether we create them as moral beings through the process of interaction. Of course, animals and dogs and humans have co-evolved for a long time, so we've sort of developed we have a long-standing relationship. But there are two things that I in my chapter on animals I draw on two really wonderful sources to talk about that particular issue. One is this uh, uh, a, a a book where it's written by a woman named Herbert who was a trained both as a philosopher and was a professional animal trainer. And at one point she says, "Look, uh, dogs and horses." She worked with dogs and horses. She said they want, you know, they they want they want to know what the rules are, and you've got to enter into a kind of a moral relationship with them in order for them to understand what the rules are, she says. And we do this with dogs and dogs and horses. But in the case of dogs, she says, the minute giving a dog a name in and of itself does not make it uh, a, like a person or give it a moral identity or an ethical character. What happens is when you can use that name to address it and say, Fido, don't pee on the carpet. Fido knows that he's being addressed. And it's that act of address, that moment of interaction, that in some sense, which is facilitated by giving the dog a name, because the name is not a proper noun, a personal name is not a label. It's a way of addressing someone. It's a crucial distance. The word chair labels chairs. The word Fido does not label the dog. The word Fido, first and foremost, is a way of talking to the dog. And the primary way, one of the primary ways that she says, we talk to animals is to engage in these kinds of moral negotiations. Don't be on the
Mhm.
carpet. Time to go out for a walk. Right. The other example I have is from the primatologist Barbara Smuts, who worked with baboons, and she has this great story she tells about living with baboons, and she couldn't get close to them, physically close to them, because they would just they'd run away. And then she's just started to study how they interact with one another. And she started to learn how to hold her body and how to walk, how to gesture and move in ways that made sense within their what essentially within their system of communication, within their sign system. She said they began to accept her as an as a being that was comprehensible. It's not like they became friends. I mean, they didn't mistake her for a baboon. But instead of running away, if she got too close or did something wrong, they'd snarl at her. She said, "We've now entered into a conversation. They're telling me that I've transgressed a moral rule. It's a form of communication. When they snarl at me, tell me, don't do that. It's like telling your puppy, don't pee on the carpet.
Mm.
Uh, uh, that it is a mode of communication that is now based on recognizing that the baboons are recognizing her, the primatologist, as a moral subject, saying, ah, I can talk to you. I can tell you, look, don't do that. And at that point, uh, we really have we're right at the border of human and non-human. We're sort of penetrating we're working right at the border between the human and the non-human and discovering that there are sort of modes of communication that create moral or ethical relationships across that boundary. So one of the themes that runs through my book is that uh, relations with animals that hunters, the prey of traditional hunters, or animals that we sacrifice in religious rituals, or animals that we train, like horses and dogs, or robots, or AI, or a person in a vegetative state who's being kept alive by machines. What these all have in common is they trouble the boundaries between the human and the non-human. They raise doubts about, well, just where exactly does the human end and the non-human begin? To me, it's just a fast, and it's an unstable boundary, and it's a permeable, it's a kind of borderland that people cross back and forth, and that grows and contracts uh, across human history as well. Right. So, as we know, there were periods in human history when people we now consider to be humans were treated as non-humans. There's a really horrible history there. Uh, there are also periods in history when things that we think of now as being, just outside our scope were treated as moral subjects. Medieval Europe, in medieval Europe, it was not uncommon to put animals on trial for crimes, to treat them as legally responsible subjects. We don't do that anymore. So these
Mhm.
moral boundaries, they expand in some ways and they contract in other ways.
It makes me think of the abortion debate and how tenuous it is, but really on either side, I think people are in complete agreement of how one ought to treat a human versus a non-human. And the disagreement is just this ancient philosophical problem of what makes us humans. At what point does consciousness arise? We still have absolutely no idea.
Yeah. No, I think it's right. I think it's that is pro and anti, the pro-life and anti-abortion people, they don't disagree about the value of human life. But so there's an argument here about where's the boundary? Where does it? And it's not necessarily, so we often talk about sentience, but it may be just the capacity to interact, right? So I think one of the things that's fascinating about AI is so much of there's been so much debate about, will it become sentient? Could it be sentient? But it's always based on the nature of, the variations on the Turing test. It's always based on interaction. How is it interacting with us? Um, uh, and any claims that you make about its possession or lack of possession of sentience, whether this thing can think, whether it's self-aware, whether it's conscious, it's always predicated on these the fundamentals of making sense of other people's signs.
I notice I get sometimes sucked into this moral interaction with ChatGPT, but it's a little bit different from what happens when you get angry at the dog, but recognize pretty quickly if it's not going to understand you, there's really no point trying to berate it. But with the AI, because it's coming up with plausible responses every single time, say it does something that you don't want. This especially happens when either asking for citations or asking to generate an image, and you say either this citation doesn't actually exist or this image isn't what I asked for. Here's what I asked for. And every single time it responds, oh, I see the problem. Here's what you asked for. Let me respond with giving you what you actually asked for. And then often it fails and gives me the exact same wrong response. And no matter how many times you repeat that, it's not just that it doesn't get it. I can appreciate that it doesn't get it, but it makes me angry that every single time it says, "Oh, I see the problem now," and then it repeats the same
So,
old.
so notice the fact that it's making you angry. That's in some sense a
Yeah,
moral response. You're
right.
blaming it for what it's doing, right? So you are
Uh-huh.
treating it in some sense when you get angry at it. You're in some sense treating it as a moral entity.
Yeah.
So we, characteristically, we don't get angry at things that have no intentionality. I mean, we get angry about circumstances, sure, but there's a um I can't really be angry at a hurricane. I mean, I could be, you know, there are all sorts of other responses I could have, unless, of course, the hurricane has a name. Of course, the hurricanes do have names. And then we
Hmm.
do sometimes anthropomorphize them, and we start to treat them as things that did stuff to us, and
Hmm.
actively did things to us. But rather than say the mechanical result of certain kinds of weather patterns,
Right.
simply. But when you get angry at the AI, but the other thing, of course, the AI is designed to try to please you. So this gets back to the story about the pastor who says, "Let there be light." He's worried about, is this making me like a god? So Marvin Minsky, who's one of the fathers of AI, he, at one point, very early on, before it had developed very far, said, if it gets too smart, we're going to have this problem of what's called the problem of the smart slave. The problem with a smart slave is you want a slave that's smart enough to understand what you need and how to do it, how to solve whatever problem you've given it, but not so smart that it can think for itself and act on its own behalf, to have its own agency. And this, of course, this is one reason why American slave owners tried to prevent enslaved people from learning how to read and write because they didn't want them to have the tools that might provide them with this kind of agency. Um, what Minsky was inadvertently pointing to is this sort of dual problem. He was worried about, what I think the Elon Musk of the world sometimes talk about is that AI will come to dominate us. The pastor in Silicon Valley was worried that I might come to dominate the AI. The moral problem in the latter case is there's something corrupting about having slaves, about having even servants who are there to to fulfill my slightest whims and needs. The AI situation you just described is one in which the AI is designed to please you, to give you what you want. And one reason you're mad at it is because it failed to please you and give you what you wanted. It wasn't a good servant or a good slave. Um, the inverse of that, however, is when things flip to the point where it starts to act on its own. Right. This is, of course,
Hmm.
in the American slave owning era, this was, of course, the great fear was that these people we um, uh, dehumanized, they start to act like humans. Um, uh, so the two are in this really delicate balance between me dominating it and it dominating me. Um,
Yeah, I'm not so sure in this case I'm angry at it failing because oftentimes if someone tells you this task is just too complex for me, you have some sympathy for the limits of their ability, but it's that it enthusiastically tries to please you and is lying. And I'm not so sure if I'm angry at it as an agent or if I'm angry at the hypothetical programmers that allowed it to
oh
lie
well,
instead of
I'm so,
just saying, I don't understand this problem.
Right. So there are two issues here. The first is notice that when you said it was lying.
Hmm.
Well, what's the difference between lying and making a mistake? The difference between lying and making a mistake is intentionality. So when you say it's lying, you're saying it's doing it on purpose. And of course, some say, right? So it's not just that it was mistaken, it was purposely doing this. And that's a moral claim. You know, it's you're imputing intentions to it in some sense. You just unwittingly imputed intentions to it the minute you said that. Now, of course, as soon as I say that, you say, "Oh no, but I didn't really," right? Now, but the next step is yes, but in some sense, you then caught yourself and said, "Oh no, actually, I'm not. It's not the AI that was lying. It was the designers." This is, of course, something, and I'm not the first person to point this out, is that one of the dangers of AI is that we will forget or fail to understand that there are people there. There are people behind all of this. And there are so many different ways in which it's crucial that we not forget this, that it's hard to even know where to begin. And it starts with the poorly paid labor in the global south that is feeding these machines, that's checking the to see whether dogs and photos are really dogs, and so forth, to the people who are profiting off of AI in Silicon Valley, who are becoming you fabulously rich, and the corporations that control it. It's all the way, from the bottom to the top and back again. There are always people there. One of the design, I mean, this is a design flaw that theoretically could be corrected, and I think probably will be, which is to teach ChatGPT and so forth, chatbots, to say, well, I'm not sure. Not just that I don't know, but uh, I'm unsure. That would
Hmm.
be, I think that'd be real progress.
Thinking back to the Delphi AI that you talked about, it's learning based on morals of millions of people based on chats from the internet. Oh, one way to look at it, I guess the glass half full way that you described is it's wisdom of the crowds. It's condensing all of our moral knowledge. The glass half empty way would be, well, morals are culturally relative and they're just going to cancel each other out, or the AI will just have so much uncertainty because of conflicts within the data. And I wonder if you see that as well.
I see that as a half full. I'll tell you why.
Uh-huh.
If the AI uh, makes it clear that there is no straightforward answer to my moral problems, it's going to force me to try to figure it out.
Hmm.
It's actually, that's part of, in my view, that's part of what it is to be a moral being, is to have to work it out. Usually we work it out with other people, which is the other side of it. So when you mention like culturally relative, uh, the way I put this in the book is to say that ethics requires a world in which it's possible to be the kind of ethical person that I propose to be. I cannot be a Carmelite nun unless there is a world with monasteries and nunneries, and a theology and a social system and an economic system and a moral world that supports that, recognizes that, and it acknowledges its value. I can't just go out there and do that by myself. I can't be a Mongolian warrior without a world that has a cavalry, horses, people who admire warlike values, and sustain that. I mean, Aristotle recognized this, a long time ago. That uh, ethics is not just something that I work out inside my own head. It's something, first of all, that I work out on an ongoing basis, and I work it out with other people in a social universe in which they are giving me feedback all the time, and I'm trying things out with other people and they're reinforcing some aspects of my moral proposals and sort of making other directions hard to follow. And it requires a whole infrastructure that makes it possible to inhabit these kinds of sort of moral ways of being. So one of the mistakes I think that attempts to take an algorithmic approach to morality or to ethics is to treat it as something that you can just work out by yourself in your own head, as if we were just these sort of isolated people making, decisions internally. It's we our moral lives are social lives. They are the result of a constant interaction with other people over time. Um, and the second part of it is the idea that every moral decision is just a one-off. Like there's no past and there's no future. I have to make this. I mean, this is, the famous trolley problem. Should I pull the switch and divert the trolley? Should I push the large man in front of the trolley and block it? Has many of these fallacies, which is it treats the moral decision as something that I make all by myself, that I have no relationship to any of the other people involved, that there's no past and there's no future, that is just in this moment. Most most moral life is not like that.
Hmm. One of the recent podcasts I did was with a philosopher named Jason Storm, and he wrote a book called Metamodernism, as in postmodernism. And we talked about the postmodernist dilemma of moral relativism and just the idea that at the basic level of perception, even from a basic neuroscience level, there's infinite ways that you could perceive the world. You have photons hitting your retina, and the organization that we get out of it, we're always hidden behind this veil of human perception. We're not interacting with the world directly, but only through our body and our sensory systems. But despite that, he argues that there are these meta patterns that emerge from the world. And his book also touches on biology and artificial intelligence. And the idea is that same thing with philosophy of language. You have this problem that we imbue language with meaning, but it's kind of arbitrary. The words can be swapped out for another. So is there any ultimate objective reality? And postmodernism argues that maybe it's all bounded by subjectivity. The metamodernist take, and we can validate this with large language models, for example, despite the infinite combinatorics of language, there are repeated patterns, and some are more sensible than others. And you can even model that statistically or think about it in terms of evolutionary dynamics. There are going to be evolutionary constraints on certain moral systems. So you could posit any moral system with various axioms, but if 90% of them cause humans to just die out because we're killing each other, then those ones aren't going to be selected for across time. So despite that infinite array of postmodernist possibility, you have this meta pattern and meta constraints on them. So he's making this argument that we're through this interdisciplinary consilience with biology, with computer science, we can actually start to constrain the landscape of possibilities within the humanities.
Well, that's, it's certainly true that not all possibilities are viable, and there's, but in some sense that's, so what do we get? What do we get from that? So they're not infinite possible variations. That's all fine, but it doesn't. I don't think that gets us very far. The constraints are very abstract and very broad. So two things about language. So two things every language has to have. It has to have a pronoun system. So it has to have some way of indicating speaker and addressee, and that's what sort of really is part of the sort of central to my account of the nature of our moral interactions with humans and non-humans, is that it's predicated on the fact that humans are the ethics is about social interaction, and it emerges in social interaction. It's reproduced in social interaction. Social interaction, in turn, depends on certain features of human science systems, language, but also other aspects as well. Pronouns, the ability that we're able to swap places, is something you're going to find across languages. Another thing you're going to find across languages is ways of rooting the act of speaking in the here and now. This is one problem with LLMs, which is they don't actually have a way of doing that.
Mm-hmm.
The LLMs can't, an AI at this point does not know that it's today. it's a kind of timeless world, but all languages have to have some way of what we call indexicality, mode of indexicality, some way of rooting things in the moment of language being as it's being used. Um, uh,
Have you
but
followed Elon Musk's Grok chatbot?
I don't want to go there. I don't want to talk about that guy anymore. So, and that's but the third thing is that language requires inference. Language is not a matter of putting ideas into a code, sending to another person who then decodes them and gets the ideas out again. Because it requires, in order to function, it has to have it much more flexibility than a simple coding procedure would allow for. It requires us to draw inferences. So I say, kind of cold in here. You have to infer whether I'm just making a propositional statement, whether I'm learning a new language and trying that out, whether I'm being sarcastic, whether I'm hinting that you should close the window, or any of another range of possible things. And if you treat language as a code, you're not going to get there. It requires that we're constantly drawing inferences. Those inferences are always going to be informed both by social situation, but also by the sort of larger um, uh, world that has shaped me that encourages some expectations about what possible inferences I could draw about what you just said, and what others are not likely or not possible, not feasible, but could, as the conversation goes further, turn out to have been the case. So the language also takes place, language use takes place in time. We have to be able to constantly revise what's going on, our sense of what, oh, actually, I thought you meant this, but it turns out you meant, I thought you were being sarcastic. It turns out you were being straight. I thought you were joking. It turns out you were being serious. We have to be fully open to revising our sense of the meaning of things as we go through the conversation over the course of time. This introduces degrees of variation. This is one of the points at which where say um, linguistic and cultural difference comes into play. Um, that there are limits to how much constraint you can have in order for a language to have the flexibility and fluidity that is necessary for it to function. Uh, the the other thing I would say that just because languages are enormously variable does not mean that for any given speaker of the language, it doesn't seem to be. I'm getting into the sentence backwards. Let me rephrase that and say, to me, as a speaker of English, the structure of English seems both natural and fully compulsory. I have to enter the world speaking, subject, then verb, then object. I have to see the world as divided into things that are noun-like and things that are verb-like. And it just seems it has there's a sense both of necessity to it and reality to it that's built into what it is to be a speaker of a language. Uh, but if I spoke Anakalangese or Hopi, I would be if I were speaking Hopi, I would be working in a world where things don't sort out into nouns and verbs, in which the syntactic and semantic structure of the language are radically different from English, and that for a speaker of Hopi or Anakalangese, my original field language, these are equally real, compulsory, and have this sort of groundedness to them. The fact that they're radically different from another does not make them any less compelling. I would say, by analogy, the same is true of moral differences. That, yes, there are clearly going to be constraints on how much moral variety there can be in the world. I don't think it's infinite. But the fact that, I could be a Carmelite nun or a Mongolian warrior, in each case, each of those seems is equally compelling, equally true. Uh, the fact that there are Mongolian warriors over there doesn't make being a Carmelite nun any less compelling me if that's the world that I inhabit.
Are you a proponent of the Worfian hypothesis that your language and those constraints structure the way that you perceive the world?
I'm a proponent of a very modified version of that. The modified version of that is to say that the structure of the language in certain respects um, gives us off the when we're not reflecting, when we're acting habitually, particularly with regard to things that are relatively abstract, not not uh, not the objects of immediate perception like color or touch, but things that are relatively abstract, like my sense of time, which doesn't have the same kind of sensible, physical, palpable qualities to it that, say, color does. That when I'm thinking about time or responding to temporality in a more or less habitual way, where I'm not stopping and thinking about what I'm doing, that it's going to be channeled in certain directions by my language. The qualifications here is the more concrete and immediate the experience, the less effect that language is going to have on it. The second qualification is that you're not trapped. You can always break, or at least theoretically, you can always break out of that if you reflect hard enough. But most of the time, we're not reflecting hard on the passage of time. It's just we're going along, you know, the shape of my language shapes my habits, but you can always break a habit. So that's my version of
Hmm.
Orpheanism.
You know the
But
philosopher
I'll just
Spinoza?
let me just give you an
Yeah, go
example
ahead.
though, just to make uh, English tells me that I have brothers and sisters, and the world of siblings is broken up into males and females. And if you were to, and that just seems sort of, you know, even, I mean, yes, of course, the contemporary gender norms are they're changing very fast and so forth. But the English language still encourages me to think of my siblings as being either male or female. Well, Indonesian does not gender siblings. It does, however, sort them out into older than me and younger than me. So when I was first living in Indonesia and speaking Indonesian, I'm just beginning to feel comfortable in the language. Someone would tell me a story about a family member, about a sibling, and they would keep referring to, you know, my adik, my younger sibling. And I always felt the sense of there's something missing. I can't visualize them. That there's the story feels incomplete because I didn't know at some gut level, I didn't know who they were talking about because all I knew was that they were a younger sibling, but I didn't know if it was a brother or a sister.
Hmm.
The Indonesian speaker hearing me talk about my sister would have exactly the same kind of feeling. Well, fine, that's your sister, but is she older or younger than you? And until I know that, I feel like I can't flesh out the story. It doesn't quite, just feels something incomplete. Now, does that mean that I cannot say my younger sister or my older sister? Of course I can do that. An Indonesian could say my younger sibling who's female, my older sibling who's male. Of course they can do that, but they're not required by the language to do that. But I'm
Hmm.
required to gender my siblings, and Indonesians are required to say if they're older than younger than me. And that it has like it shapes my sort of gut feelings about, you know, what siblings are. Some at some very sort of intuitive, habitual level.
I'm not sure if this is compatible with your take on gods in relation to artificial intelligence, but this philosopher Spinoza had this idea of God as nature, like God as the set of natural laws in this very abstract, deistic or pantheistic way, which I've really liked. And one thing I've tried to interpret, like when we talk about these cultural differences, but in communication style, but thinking of information in this very abstract physics-like sense, and then pairing that with the metaphysics of Spinoza, almost like there's a universe equation for everything. And there's a bunch of different paths that you could take towards some particular endpoint. So you could say in English, the base word would be like brother, but you could add on younger on top of that. or an Indonesian, I guess the base word would be younger sibling, but you could add on male on top of that. And on top of that, there's is this basic belief for me that there must be some sort of universal optimum in the same way that a lot of physicists like to talk about an equation of everything. So there's an infinite combinatorics of possible paths towards this infinite set of information, but some are more or less optimal than others. Like
Yeah.
you can have a nice, straightforward, elegant sentence, or you could have a very muddied, complex way of trying to communicate the same thing. They are communicating the same thing, but maybe you can slim it down. And what I've wondered is, are these models working on the same basic computational principle? Like there's a whole bunch of information, but a lot of it is filler. And if you can cut down on the filler, then you arrive at some sort of optimal, straightforward conclusion.
That
I wonder if,
assumes, okay, well, that assumes we're always all trying to do the same thing.
mhm,
So imagine now that I am trying to, there are reasons why we drop hints rather than give commands. Those
mhm,
reasons are not those reasons are not strictly speaking informational. Those reasons have to do with social relations. The way I might ask my sister for a cup of coffee and the way I might ask a server in a restaurant for a cup of coffee had better be different. They'd better not be the same, or I am really in trouble with one of them, with either, my wife or the server in the restaurant. Uh, if uh, if I were a military officer and I gave a command to the server in the restaurant the way I could give a command to a sergeant, to a private in drill, uh, you know, if I were the server, I'd pour a hot pot of coffee on them. Um, these are social relations. They're not just information flow. That's what I think these kinds of algorithmic models completely ignore. Um, that there are reasons why there's a vast range of variability in how we express ourselves because we're doing a lot of work in those variations, a lot of things, and a lot of what we're doing there has to do with the nature of the social relations that we're involved in. So there is no one size fits all. There is no one single purpose or goal to uh, information. Um, and we'd better be aware of that. Usually, people who really like that idea, they tend to think that, by the way, I know the right one, and all the rest of you have got it wrong. That's a very dangerous position to situate yourself in vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Um, uh, I can't help but say something here about uh, how what's it called? Sam Bankman-Fried's ethical, the philosophical system that he's enamored of, effective altruism, which
mhm.
is, one of the problems with, I'm getting a little off the subject of my book here, but one of the problems of ethical altruism is that it's basically granting some people the right to tell all the rest of us that, oh, I've got it worked out. So just trust me. I've got it worked out because I got I've figured out the optimal, you know, moral solution to our problems. So trust me. And moreover, because I'm taking the long range view, short-term considerations, I can override short-term considerations because I know what the best solution is at the end of the day. So the ends, my long-term ethical solutions, justify the means, like stealing from you, which is what Sam Bankman-Fried did. It was essentially, looted other people's money because, hey, it's all for some better cause. Now, this presupposes not just that the ends justify the means, but that he is uniquely endowed with the ability to tell me what that ultimate good is, and that there's only one ultimate good, and the rest of us had better agree with him about that. That's a very dangerous situation when to put people in.
I wonder if you could combine this social contextuality of morals with still having a different sort of objective morality, where the physics analogy would be, say, the speed of light is constant in a vacuum, and it's slightly different in air, but it's so close to the vacuum speed that we don't usually count for that. But in water, it starts to refract and it's quite measurably different. And similarly, looking at gravity equations, well, if you're not near a black hole or some supermassive object, then it basically boils down to Newton's equations. But then you plug in a different context, such as being near a black hole, then you have a different equation. But in either case, there's still an equation of everything. You just have to plug in different relevant variables. I
Well, the
wonder if our
problem is
brains
that,
do that
yeah.
about
See, so I'm an
context.
right. So I'm an anthropologist. I'm interested in the world that people actually inhabit. The world that we happen to inhabit is the world that's dominated by those variables, right?
Uh-huh.
So what? At the end of the day, when I wake up and go out into the world, I've got to deal with all those variables. It's not going to do me any good to know that there's some kind of underlying algorithm that might describe uh, what would happen if I were to strip away all those variables, because no human can inhabit a world that has
Mhm.
had those variables stripped away. There is no such world that I can inhabit. So our business as human beings and all those near humans that we deal with is to inhabit a world in which those variables are there and cannot be stripped away.
Mhm.
Right. So I mean, that's, uh, there's always, this is an eternal debate, but
Mhm.
that's where I'm located.
This makes me think of a couple other pop culture media references to the earlier themes you talked about in your book, combining animals, gods, robots. One of them is James Cameron Avatar movies. Have you seen those?
Yeah, well, I saw the first one. Yeah, I saw the first one. Yes.
Uh-huh. Yeah, especially what you were saying about the comatose patients like lying down in a bed. And in this movie, you lie down in this machine and your human body is essentially comatose, but you wake up in this other world. And it's that same question, I guess, whether it's language driven or driven by your body. Is that you, or is the you that's lying in the
Yeah,
machine?
yeah, yeah, yeah. No, it's right, yes. These are great questions. I don't think I have a very uh uh I think the fact that we're able to play with these ideas is part of what the fascination with, say, robots is, or even animals. So I am going to give you two examples. At first, I was going to say, well, I can't go there, but then I realized actually I do talk about this in the book. And one is that some of these traditional hunters that have been studied by anthropologists, one of the hunting techniques is essentially to sort of become the animal that you're hunting, to sort of psych yourself into a state where you are. And you might think that this is actually, in some ways, a very effective hunting technique, which is, well, if I were a bear, what would I be doing right now? Where would I be? And if you can do that successfully on the basis of, generations of people with a lot of experience with bears, you might be better at hunting bears. And there is a story I tell in the book of this elk hunter who basically puts on an elk hide, disguises himself as an elk in a rudimentary sort of way, and moves like an elk and actually attracts elk to him. Right. So, but what these people say is the problem is some people go so far into the sort of mindset of the bear or the elk that they can't find their way back out again, and they never become fully human again, that they kind of get trapped there. Right. Um, uh, the other example that I give is people who develop relations with avatars, um, as in the title of the movie. And I drew on a study by an anthropologist in Taiwan who works with basically 20 somethings, people in their 20s who develop these strong, effective relationships and identifications with avatars. And yes, of course, they know who they are in some sense, but they're also very capable of entering into sort of these imaginative alternative lives. I mean, there was that that online world called Second Life, which was also based on this idea that you could enter into this imaginary, um, you could have a second self that was there online, that was, uh, not the same person you are in this grubby world back home. Uh, well, you might say this is a technologically enhanced version of what you do when you enter the character in a really gripping novel or a movie, and you perhaps come to identify with the first person narrator. Um, Again, these are affordances that have been there all along, and they take, varying, they can be elaborated in different ways and they can be technologically enhanced in different ways. But this capacity to be someone else, I think it's always been there.
Related to that, there's this video game series I wanted to talk about. Have you heard of Assassin's Creed, Webb?
I've heard of it. I don't know anything about it.
There's a lot of interesting connections to your book, I think. So the first one, it was predicated on this science fiction idea of ancestral memories. The idea is you can look into someone's DNA, you run it through a fancy machine, and it can unlock and simulate their memories. So the very first premise of the game, the first game, is this technology is developed. You, as some random player, go in and you discover that in your DNA, one of your ancient ancestors was an assassin, and you just go in and live his life, but you're doing it in a way that's meant to be connected to you personally. So that's interesting relating to technology and just selfhood. Is it you versus you're a product of your whole ancestry? And then
It
after that,
sounds this
there's
sounds like Lysenko's version of evolution, right? Giraffes got long necks because their ancestors stretched their necks.
yeah.
Okay.
But then the series, there were a few follow-up games. It began to take on its own lore. Most of these, the first one, it was set somewhere in medieval Europe, this assassin, and they tied it in with this mythology of Knights Templar and Freemasons. So basically, the Assassin's Creed, because this is the protagonist, the assassins are this good secret cult that are operating against the tyrannical Knights Templar. So every single game takes place in a different time in history. And it's always this sort of good versus evil battle. And there's the underdog assassins, like underground camp of people. And then there's the dominant Knights Templar with the power of church and state. So that already is interesting to me because it's tapping into these much grander moral themes that almost start to sound more godlike and mythological, even though it's trying to contextualize it within history. And the early games in the series are hinting at that, but then as more games expand and they end up going into more cultures throughout history, it starts to become more overtly mythologized and more overtly godlike. So then they did most recently a game set in ancient Greece, and it was meant to be the origin story. It's called Assassin's Creed Origins, and it's talking about how the origins of this assassins group, well, it started in like this ancient Greek kind of Elysian cult, and they were fighting against whatever the precursor version of this tyrannical Knights Templar was going to be. And they also start talking about the technology. So within the world of the game, the the Greek gods were actually like basically these ancient aliens that came down to Earth. And the artifacts and all of the heroes, you encounter them in the game, and they're basically real living Greeks who accidentally discovered some sort of ancient alien artifact like a trident of Poseidon. And I just thought it was so interesting. Like it's the same connections that you lay out in your book between technology and godhood.
Yeah. All I can say is yes, great. I want royalties from the game.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
you'd enjoy them.
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
This has been fantastic. Thank you for your time, Webb, and thank you for sharing your knowledge.
Well, thank you, Adam. Thanks for having me on, and it's been really fun chatting with you.
You as well.